Thanks everyone for being here. My book is, as Henry summarized, it's both a critique of free trade economics, building on most of the people in this room actually, so building on many of the people's works in this room, while also trying to advance an alternative vision. And I'm trying to be, what I would consider to be, sober in this alternative vision. And I play with the notion of the term imperfect in the book, in terms of imperfections from economics. And I talk about imperfect legacies that, despite their imperfections, are still superior to what we've seen under free trade regimes. But all I'm really going to talk about today is I'm going to talk about the title, Alternative Trade. And the reason I chose alternative trade is because I'm trying to steer the reader in that book out of two different thought traps. One of them is the free trade trap, and the other one, I think, is the fair trade trap, which is what I've worked on in a lot of my previous work. The free trade trap, obviously, is the dominant ideological fantasy of our time. And this is despite the fact there's large and growing bodies of literature pointing out the limits and the myths of what we would call free trade, that it doesn't actually exist. It continues to advance as a political and ideological package. So I think it's important in the book to be clear on what I mean when I'm challenging free trade. What I'm challenging is what I just bundled together a lot of great ideas, including a lot of great ideas from people in this room, under the free trade package. And that package to me includes free trade economics, and that's in their academic and more popular forms. And as many people, I think, in this room know, that real-world economics very frequently diverge from a lot of the speculative assumptions inherent in neoclassical economics. The real world, I argue, is always imperfect. This is looking for imperfections in the real world, you'll find they're always there, except in this room. The package also includes free trade politics. So, and this, many people in the room have been central of advancing this argument. I just see Ricardo just on the side of my eye when I talk about this. You know, free trade agreements, as many of us know, have long been criticized for not evenly eliminating trade barriers, but having all kinds of other components around intellectual property, services, protecting transnational corporations from the abilities of states to regulate them in social, environmental, and labor ways. And the third part of this package is the free trade ideology. And on this one, I draw from the work of Jodi Dean. For those of you that are familiar with her, she's a Zizekian sort of political economy cultural theorist. And she has this great notion of the ideological fantasies of free trade that I can't get into here, but she talks about the way that these fantasies operate in a way that the dominant ideology and its pundits of our time continue to insist that we are perpetually moving towards a world of free trade, even though we never managed to get there. And Jodi Dean calls that the excuses role of fantasy. So I lump those together into the free trade package. And I seek to find what would an alternative, how can we look for alternatives to the free trade package? And that's where I get to the second thought trap, which is fair trade. And I think the trap with fair trade, which, you know, I buy fair trade coffee and we all drank fair trade coffee, which Steve Topik has pointed out to me we've run out of. So there's only so much fair trade coffee we could buy, but we're out of it. But, you know, I buy it and I drink it and I support it. But I also think that the trap with it is it limits significantly our possibilities for what we can imagine trade could look like. And I'll come back to that in a second. So for this reason, I define alternative trade, and I define alternative trade in the book with three defining characteristics. The first one, and I'm looking back at some historical models when I do this, is I look at alternative trade being explicitly devoted to the use of state power to manage the markets for broader social and developmental ends. And in this sense, I contrast it with free trade, which claims that the state can be removed from the market. Now, I'm not saying that's true. I don't think the history of capitalism reveals that to be true. I think the history of capitalism reveals that the growth and development of historical capitalism has brought with it the largest state bureaucracies in human history to impose all kinds of rules and regulations and create a market in the first place. And of course, the most important rule and regulation that the state has to impose for capitalism is that of private property. So the models I'm looking at that are alternative trade have recognized the importance of the state and state power. And I think that this is perhaps the greatest challenge you can actually make to free trade, is beginning to talk about what the state can do right instead of just what it can do wrong. So that cynicism that comes from that is the cynicism of my work over the years on fair trade. Just to give you an example with, say, fair trade coffee, which I've frequently written about in some of my work drawing on a lot of people here. Fair trade coffee, for example, only reaches 3% of the world's coffee families. So there's 97% still left to be reached. And there are an agreement that I look at in the book, drawing quite a bit on John Talbot, actually, the International Coffee Agreement, that did actually, it was a state-managed agreement, north and south, that did prop up prices that were actually as high and some years higher than what we would today call a fair trade price. And that reached, in a complicated and imperfect way, all of the world's coffee farmers. So that's my first criteria. My second criteria, I talk about a devotion to social regulation. So the central premise is that, look, you cannot get the state out of the market. So I think it's essential to try to find an alternative to free trade that goes beyond regulated versus unregulated. Because markets are always being regulated. They're just not always being regulated in the interests of the poor. So to get to that, I draw on what I call social regulation, which actually builds on the new work on the social economy. It draws quite a bit on Louis Lefebvre's work on social efficiency, which is social efficiency meaning state action conducted in the interest of maximizing social welfare for society. And I say that's distinct from the ways in which the state continues to manage markets, even under an ostensibly free trade regime. And there's all kinds of examples. In the wake of the 2008 meltdown, of course, we can all think to the very obvious examples of the fact that the state manages to cough up $1 trillion of bailout money for Wall Street, despite its pretensions towards free markets, et cetera, et cetera. But there's other examples. And, Ellen Wood has this great quote in one of her books where she says, the relative decline of, what I call social regulations, this is paraphrasing her, a relative decline of social regulation has generally been confused with the decline of state regulation overall. So it's not so much the decline of state regulation as much as the decline of states' interest in regulating certain things. And then the third criteria I use in defining alternative trade is to talk about alternative mechanisms that have a pro-poor agenda. Whether these projects were designed to assist poor farmers, poor countries, or both. There's very often a class component, even if it's not always made explicitly clear. And the free trade package actually does have a very explicit class component, and that is that you make the rich richer. But if you do make the rich richer, then there'll be trickle-down benefits to everyone, and all boats will rise with the tide and all stuff. Trickle-down is a highly questionable assumption that a lot of great thinkers have debunked, but yet it persists. So with this definition in mind, I counter the free trade package with looking at what I consider to be alternative models to what that free trade package offers. And I'm not going to get into any of these models here. But I talk about the International Coffee Agreement, the Canadian Wheat Board, the EU Caribbean Banana Regime, and I end with a discussion on ALBA and a few other things. The lessons I draw from the book from this analysis, there are two central lessons I think in particular. One, I say that the decline of these sorts of alternative trade models, in the case of the Canadian Wheat Board, the Canadian government essentially eliminated it without a vote from farmers, which was required in the legislation, and it's in the courts right now, and Canadians might have to pay hundreds of millions of dollars in compensation for that. But the decline of alternative trade is not a triumph of free trade, but it's a triumph of corporate power and profitability. Only through the ideological lens of the free trade package could we see a world where, just for example, 3 banana companies control 70% of the entire world's import and exports, and 4 companies control somewhere between 75 to 90% of the global grain trade. It's only through the free trade package that we could call that free trade, right? And the second lesson I argue near the end of the book is that, look, the history of alternative trade is not as over as it's often said to be. It's perpetually consigned to the dustbin of history, the way I define alternative trade, but it always pops back up. What it's against is a very powerful political, ideological, and economic forces. But these mechanisms of alternative trade, they do keep popping up. ALBA and Petrocaribe, or Petrocarib, which I look at a bit in the book, are very creative and have all kinds of interesting and creative mechanisms on the go. I know Marty Hart-Landsberg has written some great stuff on that as well. But there's other small things that I think are beginning to emerge in very slow ways. Côte d'Ivoire began offering its cocoa farmers a minimum state-guaranteed price for cocoa in 2012. In 2013, the world's largest tea producers got together and created the Tea Producers Forum. They haven't created quotas yet or anything like that. But what's interesting is that they are explicitly refusing to say that they will not create quotas. So who knows what that will amount to. Just recently, in August 2013, Brazil began purchasing as many as 3 million bags of coffee, because as David Martin mentioned in his talk earlier today, the super cycle is over, and we'll see if that's true or not, but certainly with coffee, all the coffee pundits were celebrating about a year ago, and now coffee prices are dropping again. In September 2013, India announced a new food security law that would entitle 67% of the population to highly subsidized cheap grain. So those are just some ideas to throw them out there. They're ideas that get lost in the Western media, despite their huge ramifications. So while usually out of the spotlight of the corporate media, I'm not arguing these things are smooth and perfect by any stretch, but these southern issues do serve as a reminder that history is never over, and the future remains uncertain, and that certain countries and certain regions in certain contexts are actually experimenting with alternative things. Despite what the free trade package says, I argue alternative trade is possible, it's viable, and it can be beneficial under the right political conditions. So I'll leave it there.